was very fortunate in having a grandmother who had come across the lower part of the United States in a Conestoga. They left from lower Missouri and went through New Mexico. And in the course of their time in New Mexico, they were attacked by Indians, and they hid bullion in the rocks there in New Mexico. And she said the bullion was never found, so somewhere in those rocks there may be gold. Well, she went on to Colorado, and she and her husband, whom I never met, Isaac, lived there, and she was quite a remarkable woman. She was, as I understand, kind of the breadwinner of the family. Grandpa Isaac apparently loved to read the Bible, but wasn't much of a breadwinner. So my mother and her two sisters were born in Colorado, probably in maybe Rocky Ford or Telluride, I'm not sure absolutely where. But it was there that my mother met my daddy, Glenn Powell, and she was Iva Williams. They were married, and they were part of the westward movement because they then went to Oregon and lived in the Wallowa Valley, and my brother characterizes that as one of the most beautiful places he's ever seen. My daddy was a farmer. He'd been a telegrapher, and he'd been in the National Guard and things like that in Colorado, but they started farming in probably the late 20s, and it was in 1930 that I was born in Washington. They had subsequently then moved to a farm in eastern Washington, Mabton, where I was born, and my brothers at that point were 11 and 14 years older than I, and so I became the very spoiled little baby sister. My daddy was killed in an automobile accident, a truck accident, in 1935. This was High Depression. And my brothers, Chester, was the older of the two boys, and he was at the University of Washington. He had entered with the highest scores of any entering freshman. The younger of the two, Gene, was 3 years younger than Chet, and he was still in high school when Daddy passed. Well, the two boys then pitched in and tried to keep the farm going. It was too much for two young men like that. So they made the decision for us to move to Seattle. Here we are, this little impoverished family, just making a decision to move to Seattle. And it was sort of a grapes of wrath picture. I mean, we were in one little car with everything that we own, plus, 4 people. I had to leave my doggie behind, which just nearly broke my heart. But we got ourselves to Seattle into a little one-room apartment. And it was during that one-room apartment situation that I decided I would run away, and I ran down to the waterfront. I don't remember exactly how I got myself down there, but here was this big, the docks of Seattle. So I go up the gangplank and find myself aboard a ship which turned out to be a transport from, they were moving butterscotch from Scotland. And they took me down to the Donkeyman Greaser's Meths and gave me great big cups of tea, turned me around with a bag of butterscotch in my hand and sent me home. This was... every once in a while I would run away to kind of get away from impoverishment, but gradually my brothers got a grip on things, and one of them started selling vacuum cleaners, and they just did anything that they could. Well, then the war broke out, 1941, and Mama had gotten me a secondhand bicycle. I would deliver her Avon products on my roller skates, but now I could do it on my bicycle. And I was practicing on this used bicycle out behind our apartment when she leaned out the window and said, "Honey, we've been attacked." So that was the beginning of the war, and the younger of my two brothers, Gene, immediately enlisted in the Naval Air Corps, and that was the beginning of a long career for him. My other brother couldn't. Chet found, I think it was a question of overbite. Anyway, there was something that kept him from enlisting, which nearly broke his heart. But he ended up getting married in 45, and those were my high school years. And high school at a wonderful school, Broadway High School in Seattle, where the instructors were old school. My Latin instructor, for example, was a Harvard graduate, and those were the days when a woman, if a woman was a teacher, she couldn't be married. And so I had these long-time teacher types that were just splendid teachers. Well, that school closed in I think it was 1946, and I had to go then to Queen Anne High for my senior year. And that was kind of an interesting switch because my Aunt Hazel, mother's sister, had been a teacher there for 25 years. So it was kind of fun then for me to end up in Queen Anne High. I graduated, had some nice things happen, won enough of an award that I could go to the University of Washington for my freshman year. And my dear brother Chester had been all the way through high school. Chet would help me with everything that I couldn't understand. He got me through algebra and geometry and social studies. And he wanted me, the first thing when we went to Seattle, he didn't take me to a house, he took me to the University of Washington, and he said, "Honey, this is where you're going to go to school." So I had that kind of modeling in my background, and somebody who was lifting me actually along the way. My freshman year, here I am taking classes like Emerson and sociology and psychology and Pacific Rim and economics. I mean, who as a freshman takes these kind of courses? But it was because Brother Chet wanted me to have as broad a background. So when I then was introduced to the idea of going to Principia by my Sunday school teacher, my wonderful Mrs. Chapman, who had made sure that I stayed with her for 4 years when I was in high school, which was kind of unusual. But she saw something there that she wanted to help with. Mrs. Chapman was the one that made sure that I had the wherewithal. She and someone else in the Sunday school gave me, and I didn't know this, but she gave me the scholarship that enabled me to go to Principia College in Elsa, Illinois, and I had never heard of Principia College. It was an incredible thing for me because Mama was a single mom. She was doing everything from Childcraft to World Book to working at Frederick and Nelson and long-time sales of Avon and, just anything that she could find to do to keep us afloat. And here we were moving two little apartments, one at $23 a month and one at $25 a month. And when we had $2 extra, we'd move across the hall to the $25 a month. And then my brother and his wife moved in with us, and we moved to $32 a month. We had an extra room. So it was quite an experience, and I was had this incredible experience of being struck by a huge rock that was thrown down from the top of a ravine, and it clipped me in the ankle and really banged up my ankle to some considerable extent. So the kids that I was playing with put me on a handhold and carried me home 14 blocks. And when I got home, my mother said, "Honey, do you want to have help from Mr. Whitcomb, who was a Christian Science practitioner whom I loved, and he lived just down the hall from us." And so or did I want to go to a doctor? And I said, oh, I'd love to have Mr. Whitcomb pray for me. He did, and I was out playing on that ankle the next day. And that was a really strong entrance into Christian Science for us. The experience of having the wonderful healing prayer of Mr. Whitcomb had been preceded by several, I'm going to say years. She lived down the hall from us. Mrs. Whitcomb would bring sentinels to Mama, who so greatly needed the support, the spiritual support that came to her through knowing the Whitcombs and reading the literature and then starting to go to church. So Mrs. Whitcomb was a very important person in our lives. I was probably maybe 12. And these were the days I had started working at, Van de Kamp Bakery when I was 13. And I was managing one of their little bakeries by the time I was 15. So that was high school years. Prior to that, I'd been going down to Madison Beach and swimming every day because I could get on a trolley car and go down there for 11 cents. And those, it was a time when you could do that sort of thing. It wasn't dangerous. And I loved to swim. And so that was a kind of wonderful, cheap entertainment. And it encouraged me. I guess I was a little bit of a tomboy because I'd had these two brothers, and they'd always just expected me to be a really grown-up little girl. And Mama used to say, well, boys, she's only a little girl. But I was a little girl who loved her brothers, and I loved to be outside, and I would be outside playing baseball behind the apartment. And I got my letter, and I was the pitcher for my high school team. The whole high school experience was a really special one for me. I wasn't an outstanding student, but I was good enough to I guess I was 34th in a class of 450, so I was in the top 10%. And it gave me a little scholarship to go to the University of Washington, and then when the opportunity to go to Principia came, and I got the Northwest Regional Scholarship to do that for 3 years. I also accompanied Mother to go to the Wednesday evening meetings. I was very, I just loved Christian Science, and I think this wonderful practitioner recognized a spark there that she wanted to encourage. So that was how this other friend, who was also a teacher in the Sunday school, decided to give this scholarship, Miss Hoppock. And I didn't know who had given the scholarship until about 20 years later, when she invited me for tea one day and said, now I think it's probably time for you to know. She was a Christian Scientist, but she was also part of the Friends, the Quaker efforts, and spent quite a bit of time in Europe helping Quakers there. So anyway, she was a very important person in my life. The University of Washington was a very special place. My brother, Chester, was concerned that I didn't stay there. Of course, he didn't want me to leave. I'd had a wonderful healing of measles after we were students of Christian Science, and Chester had been in the mines in Colorado. He'd gone back to work, again, it was late Depression, and he, when he knew that I had this heavy case of measles, he immediately came home, and he was so impressed with the speed with which they were healed that he too started studying Christian Science. And then he later became class taught, and his wife and my other brother. These were long and tumultuous years because they were during the Second World War, and it was binding up the newspapers and carrying them to school and putting in 25 cents a week into a little bond fund. But I got straight A's when I was in grade school. I wish that had happened when I was in high school and college. It didn't. My grades went steadily down as I had to work more hours. By the time I got to Principia, sometimes I was working 40 hours a week in order to stay in school. In both high school and college, I was managing editor of the paper. This got started when I was at Queen Anne High, and I was very grateful to have an instructor there who helped me along the way, but made sure that I had opportunities as managing editor. Well, then when I went to Principia, and I went hoping that I could be a journalism major, they didn't have journalism as a major. I didn't want to go into creative writing. I didn't feel that was my forte. And I didn't want to be an English major because I would have had to take nothing but English classes solidly, whereas what I subsequently did was of great help to me in the amount of writing that I did later on. So my early experience in 6th grade of winning a little writing contest, of writing to a boy in New Orleans and telling him how wonderful Seattle was, and what did I want to do when I grow up? Well, I wanted to be a writer, and so, in a sense, that's what I did. Suffered until the last semester when I can remember one of the great victories was getting an A in philosophy from this man who had been an admiral in the Navy. He was a really kind of special guy, Dr. Andrews, and so that kind of put the cherry on the top for me. But those years at Principia were extremely formative, influential, wonderful. I mean, as hard as I seemed to have to work, it was something that was a joyous endeavor for me. One of the most outstanding was Dr. Gerich. He was a Swiss, and he taught European Lit. And the kind of dignity and depth that he inspired was wonderful. He was dean of faculty, and he and his wife were so kind to me. Every once in a while, somebody would slip $20 in an envelope and send it to me in the mail without a name, but I knew it was probably the Geriches that did it. A gal who had been, well, she taught English and Bible, Ilani Ingalls, and Lonnie was particularly kind to me. When I got there, she and her mother had come from Hawaii, and thus the name Iolani. And anyway, they made sure that I had dinners with them every now and again. And when by my junior year, it didn't look like I was going to be able to come back financially, and I was talking to the Dean of Women, and I said, well, Miss Davis, she said, well, honey, not everybody has to go to Principia. And I said, well, I do. And so I borrowed a little money from the Henry Strong Foundation and finished up with only $500 in debt compared to, the way people finish up these days. It was remarkable, and I stayed on as a staff member because I didn't have any money to do anything else. So at that point, they had invited me to be assistant manager of the bookstore. So I did that for 4 years. Music instructor at that time was Louis Chapin, and Louis was taking a sabbatical. And he had met Phil in Boston. Phil was a friend of Bob Peel's and various Boston people that had befriended him while he was going to the New England Conservatory of Music. And so Louis had met him when he was in Boston and knew that Phil had just finished his master's at the New England Conservatory. And so he asked if he would come to Prin and fill in while Louis was on sabbatical. Well, One of the people that turned out to be quite a pivotal person in my life later on was Frank Parker. Uh, in 1957, I made application and was accepted to go with a student Principia abroad. It was the second print abroad of the time. Frank Parker was the director. Frank was the most incredible person. I mean, he had this delightful kind of wry sense of humor. He was just indefatigable. How old was he then? Oh, maybe 60s, but boy, Frank could keep us going all day, and the kids had to run to keep up with him. It was from that particular experience that I think Frank decided that he would like to have me be his assistant for the 1963 print abroad. So in 63, there were 30 students that went. I was his assistant, and his sister went with us. And his sister had been the director of the education program of the Art Institute in Chicago. So here we had these two incredible people. Frank, this was never mentioned in anything, but I just found out later, he danced with Pavlova across South America. He was a person who just knew every artistic highlight that we ought to see. So between those two trips, the one in 1957 was 10 days in England, and then the rest of the quarter traveling, starting with Mont Saint-Michel and going around the southern part of France and ending up at the Institut du Panthéon in Paris. They crammed as much French into us as they could, and then they shipped us over to the Sorbonne, where we had 9 classes a day in French. And we had to turn in our journals every week to poor Frank Parker, who had to read these pitiful journals. But it was just a wonderful experience. We lived on the right bank in the Hotel Jumini, which was little hotel, but it was on this very elegant street, so that when we would leave home in the morning, we'd walk right by the Louvre, cross the bridge to the Sorbonne. So that was a marvelous experience. Okay, fast forward to 63. And here we are. We're doing the rise of Western civilization, which started in Greece, Italy, Switzerland, France, and England. So we have 15 days in Athens, and we go up to Delphi. All of the artwork of Greece comes alive, and 3 weeks in Florence in northern Italy, Venice, on to Switzerland, and the kids were so eager to have milk. They hadn't had milk in Greece or Italy. They hadn't had peanut butter in Greece or Italy. And when we left Switzerland, and we were traveling down to the southern part of France, and these kids were just, they were so grateful to be on this trip, but they got to a restaurant, which was an elegant, I don't remember the name of it, but it was a really special restaurant, and the bloody meat was visible. The kids wouldn't touch it. And the chef said, well, what do they like to eat? Because they wouldn't eat the chantilly on the dessert. And Mr. Parker said, oh, they like hamburgers and peanut butter. But anyway, we had these then probably 5 or 10 weeks in Paris, and then on to England. So that 1963 trip, with my dear husband, Philip Newman, staying at home and teaching in 2 very difficult schools in Cedar Rapids, was it was a life-changing experience for me. I'm very grateful to Philip Newman for being willing to let me go. The years from 55 to 58 were my house mothering years. First year was in Anderson West, and then I had 2 years in Howard House. And it's the Howard House experience that I remember the most. I hope to participate in some way in the Howard Society because Howard House became a really special experience for me. We started things like a little musical that we would have every Sunday evening, and I worked very closely with the women's organization within the house. By 1958, I decided that I probably better try my wings somewhere else, and I applied to Hallmark greeting cards. They had an editor's position open, and so I got the job as editor. And they were at that time, and I'm sure they still are, an incredible company. Mr. Hall had a huge garden, and he would have this lovely buffet of things for us at lunch. So Philip had proposed to me early in the time that I had moved to Kansas City, because he said he'd gotten tired of commuting between Iowa City, where he was working on a doctorate, and Kansas City. And so we were to be married the following June. And during that year, you know how it is when you're going to be married, you always want to lose weight. So I had Mr. Hall's wonderful vegetables for lunch, and I'd have a bit of oatmeal for breakfast and a boiled egg for supper. I mean, it was a pretty Spartan existence, but I did lose a lot of weight, and I got down to 126, which is the most remarkable I have had for a long time. That experience at Hallmark that led to my being asked, after we had been married and moved to Iowa City, that I would do research, long-distance research for Hallmark on both their religious lines and their children's lines. So that became a nice little perk when I needed to work after we were in Iowa City. Anyway, that time in Kansas City was a really special experience for me in terms of Christian Science also, because I attended Third Church, where Dr. Tutt and his wife, longtime wonderful, monumental Christian scientists, attended. Jean Hebenstreet, who later went on to become a practitioner and teacher. Bill Ainsley, who went on to become a practitioner. Don Swinney, Mark Swinney's uncle, went on to become a practitioner. So these were my close friends there in Kansas City, and it was a really kind of marvelous experience for me. The Howard House was kind of my home away from home, so it was special for me to be married in the Howard House living room with all of my faculty friends, staff friends, standing around the side, and the people who participated in the wedding had been special friends of Phil's and mine. And we did that little, what to me was a beautiful little wedding on $100. It was a pretty special experience. We turned around and had the reception down at the other end of the room, the wedding at one end, and turning around and the reception at the other end. One of the wonderful things that happened to me when I was at Principia was the special friendship with Jocelyn Wold. Her parents lived in Chicago, and Jocelyn would invite me to come to have Thanksgiving with them or to be there at Christmas. I don't remember how often we did that, but I know subsequent to the experience in school at Prin, Sandy Ballard and I were invited to live at the Wolds for a summer while they were going to be away, and Sandy and I got jobs in Chicago. And after that, Jocelyn later was married to a wonderful man by the name of Dick Palmer. Now, the thing that Jossie and I, over the years, corresponded by Christmas cards only. We didn't have any visits any of those times. But later on, I heard that Jonathan Palmer was going to be the president of Principia. And Jonathan Palmer was the son of Jocelyn and Dick. And it was like meeting, one of my own relatives to go and meet Jonathan for the first time. And he looked so much like his dad, and I felt so at home with him. It's a perfectly wonderful thing that happened to me to tie together a very special friendship that occurred after I had graduated from Prin to be the maid of honor in their wedding. So I cherish it as a very special memory.